Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. I am here with 3 simple products to create Valentine's Day cards. You are likely to have similar items in your stash, so you can use what you have already on hand and be inspired to create your own Valentine's Day cards. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's take a closer look at the supplies first. I have a Tim Holtz sentiment stamp set. I have a Spellbinders embossing folder and then a Spellbinders nesting heart set. If you don't have nesting hearts, maybe you have 2 different size of heart dies from 2 different sets, or even perhaps a heart punch. And the sentiment set I chose specifically because not only does it have a happy Valentine's Day sentiment, but it also has some friendship sentiments that you can make Galentine's Day cards or cards for friends out of this particular set as well. But just find a sentiment from your stash that will work for you. For my color palette, I'm using all Concord and Ninth. I have Wildberry, Briar Rose, Blueberry, Lakefront, Tide Pool, Rainforest, and Honeycomb. And this will give us a range of colors to make a little traditional, but also non-traditional, especially masculine Valentine's Day cards. All right, let's go ahead and start our first card. I want to start a little more traditional with a twist, and then we'll get less traditional as we go, especially if you have guys in your life that don't want lovey-dovey mushy cards, then I've got you covered for that as well. I am going to make a shaker card. We're going to bring in some sequins, and I will use some of these sequins throughout the rest of the cards to add more decoration, and I'm going to be using gold heat embossing throughout the cards as well. I cut a card front panel to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and that will leave a nice border. I've got my heart here that measures about 4 by 4 1/2 inches, and I'm going to center that on my card front panel. I'm going to die cut the heart first, and then I'm going to emboss it with this 2D embossing folder. I like a geometric pattern because it makes it really easy to line up the edge of your cardstock so that you get nice straight embossing. I do use tape to hold it in place so that it doesn't slip on me, and I will save that die cut heart for later because I have a bonus card for you. There we go. I've got it embossed and die cut, and it is ready to get to our inking. For this one, I'm going to use the pinks and purples. I think these colors are a bit adjacent to traditional colors of the kind of bold red or bright pinks, and I prefer a slightly off traditional color palette because it feels a little fresher. All right, I'm going to ink blend this. I'm going to start on one side and blend the color into the second color on the other side. I do like to blend from my right towards my left because I'm right-handed, so just do what you need to do. Another thing that I find very helpful is a silicone mat. You can set your inks on there, and they're less likely to slip and slide on you. It's not perfect, but it is helpful. So you can see how the ink cubes can shift a little bit, but they tend to stay in place a little bit more. And I'm going to get started. Ink cubes aren't the best way to ink blend, but if that's what you have, it will definitely work. And I like to buy ink cubes because they are more affordable and you can test out a variety of colors before you know what full-size ink pads you want to invest in. All right, I like how the embossing, because it has a raised edge to it, that hits the bristles of your blending brush first and soaks up more of that color, and so you get this tone on tone effect when you ink blend over an embossed image. With that first lighter color at the top of my card, I'm going to put my heavier color at the bottom of the card. The darker color kind of helps ground the card a little bit more when it's at the bottom. Because this color can come in very hot, I am making sure that I am rubbing my blending brush on a surface to help even out any hot spots on my brush, and then I will come in with a very light hand because you can always add more color. You can't take it away once it's already there, and if you get a big splotchy oops, that's really hard to correct. So I do come in with a very light hand to see how things are behaving, and then I can add more pressure to my brush, move my finger to the head of the bristles, and push down a little bit harder, and that will give you more pressure and more ink. So I start off light, and I'm fading it away as I meet up with that other color so that we have a nice, smooth, even blend in the middle. And here is a peek at that when it's all done, and you can see that border that we created, and the nice big heart that is going to be our shaker opening window, and you can see that rich cardstock color in the background of the heart. All right, for making shakers, I like to use strips of foam, but use what you have, and I really like to recycle packaging because I don't want to buy brand new plastic when I was just going to throw this away anyway. Yes, it does usually have some imperfections in the plastic, but to me, that's a trade-off between throwing away a whole bunch of plastic and still being able to craft. I notice I have a little strip of foam adhesive stuck on my finger, and I do notice that a little bit later and take it off, but that's how crafting goes sometimes. In the meantime, I am trimming down that plastic sheet to fit just inside the borders of my paper, and then I will go ahead and adhere that down with a nice strong adhesive. I like my ATG gun, but use what you've got. If you've got liquid adhesive, that will work for sure. It'll just take a little longer to dry. Just be somewhat generous with your adhesive so that things hold together, especially if you're going to mail it. Now that our plastic is in place, let's go ahead and build the shaker. There's a couple reasons why I prefer foam strips. When I'm doing the outside edge of the shaker, I can use a double width of foam strips, and then when I snip off excess, I can then use those pieces to fill in the gaps. So here I have those two pieces. I'm going to take them apart and I will put them on either side of the point of the heart so you can get into smaller nooks and crannies, I think, with strips. The other thing that I like about strips, if you haven't seen this tip already, is that they will go around curves a lot more easily. So here I'm starting my strip on a straight, and then I will remove part of the backing liner. Then that exposes the flexibility of the foam to go around curves. I can use that liner to kind of help me tack down the foam without touching that sticky quite as much, and you can see me move it there and help press down that foam. And I will set that aside while I move on to the sequins. I will pour a pile of sequins into the middle of my card front, and if your card front is already pre-folded, it might be a little floppy, so I like to open mine up and then tack it down with a magnet to help hold it still. I will start with a little bit of each color of sequin I want to add to this, check it out, and then if I need to, add some more. Before I assemble my shaker, I'm going to be sure to put some anti-static powder into there. That helps do two things: removes the static from the plastic, and if you brush it up along the edge of your foam, it'll prevent mostly the sequins from getting stuck to the foam itself and getting stuck in place and not being able to shake around. All right, this is where I start removing the liners. At first, I just remove all of the inner liners, and then for the outer liners, I fold them back. And this was a tip I learned a while back from another YouTuber, and it really works quite nicely. To line it up, I use the edge closest to me, and I try to make the sides and the bottom have an equal margin, and usually that is enough to get the entire card front lined up. I double check it, and then I can just peel back those liners and put everything in place. If it wasn't quite right, because I don't have all that adhesive stuck down, I could still lift it up and move it a little bit and adjust it. But I got it on the first try, and there is my shaker. Now let's put some decoration on the front. This is where I've got that little bit of a twist going on to the traditional. We're gonna do paper strips, which are kind of a trend right now, and I'm using colors that aren't quite as traditional. I've got the teal and the yellow and that purpley pink, which together makes a bold alternative to traditional colors. Feel free to do you and do whatever color scheme you would like, but I really wanted to work with something that felt a little bit fresher. I am going to use this one as a Valentine's Day card. That's why I'm feeling like a little bit of pink is okay in there. And I put, "Hello friend, happy Valentine's Day." I'm also snipping the ends of my strips at an angle, and I'm going to place my strips on the card at an angle. Now I'm not doing both ends of every strip. I'm just gonna do kind of alternate strips. So one will be on the left, one will be on the right. Of course, my sentiment there you can see is on both sides. If you want your angles to be the same on all your strips, you can line it up with your original snip and follow the line of that, and then everything will match up. And then I'm just going to adhere them to the ends of the paper. I don't want to risk getting oozy glue onto my plastic, and this should hold it enough in place because that plastic is adhered right flat behind that card front panel. And here you can see it has a little bit of an undulating edge with some angles to it, and that helps make a contrast between the curves of the heart. A little bit of decoration on the inside, and this card is done. The next two cards will go just a little bit faster, and this one is my favorite, and I want to talk about the concept of using negative space. When you cut out a heart, you have the heart itself, which is the positive space, and the part that's the hole, or what's left behind, is the negative space. And when we made the shaker, we used that negative space to fill it in with shaky bits. But there are other ways to fill in and play with that negative space. Here I've created strips of cardstock. They're all 1/4 inch wide. I'm using most all the colors except for the one that I'm using for my card base. I am going to mount them with liquid glue onto just a piece of printer paper, and this is going to help create a cohesive piece for doing this technique. And I will just glue every piece down side by side, bumping them up tightly together to prevent any gaps, but you can leave gaps if you want to. All right, and then with a trim of that printer paper, this piece is done and I can die cut it. Oh, but before we do that, we're going to emboss this panel that we've created. I'm going to put my panel in upside down, technically, in this embossing folder, so that I'm going to get the debossed image. So this is going to be the portion that kind of pokes down into the cardstock, and I will give you a look of what that looks like on polka dots. And it's a really subtle technique, and it creates an interesting shadow and texture to this piece. Now I'm going to line up my heart with the exact middle, and that's easy for me to find on this because there's 6 strips of paper, so the exact middle is after those 3 strips, and I can line up my heart pokey bits onto that line, and that will give me the exact middle. Now I'm going to leave this tape together while I mount it onto my card front, and that is going to help me keep everything aligned together. So I will put foam dots on the top, skip the middle, foam dots on the bottom, and that's going to add even more depth and dimension to this card. Once I remove those backers, I can line up the very middle of this card with, again, that middle of the strips of paper. And here I am just making sure I've got the middle on my card and line that up with the middle on those papers. And then I will attach the top, make sure the bottom is also aligned, and then go ahead and press that down. And having that heart stay in the middle helped all of that process work out. Now I can pop that heart out, and there we've got the negative heart shape. And not only that, but it's a partial negative heart shape. So our brain finds it way more interesting because we're doing a little bit of work to finish off that shape in our mind. So I've got my sentiment in there and a few sequins, and this is my favorite card. All right, let's move on to the last card for the day, but don't forget, I still have a bonus for you. Our next card will have a bit of a surprise inside, but before we get to that, we have to create the outside. And I want to create 3 hearts across the front, and I want to put each word Happy Valentine's Day into each heart. So I'm trying to pick between my sizes of hearts which one will fit best. So I come up with what I need, and I know this is much harder for you if you don't have a set of nesting hearts, but you can mix and match heart dies you do have to fit your words and to fit across your card front. With my card opened up flat, I'm going to grab some low tack tape. For this kind of thing, I really like the scrapbook.com mint tape. It's slightly less sticky, and that's going to be important for the die cutting step. So what I'm going to do is spread my tape all the way across my cardstock, and that's going to do 2 things. It's going to help me align my dies, and it's also going to give me a place to mark the center of my cardstock. So my tape happens to be aligned to the fold edge of my card, but you can line it up wherever you want. And then I'm going to divide my card width in half for a 5.5 inch wide card. That is going to be 2 3/4, and then I can make a mark on that tape with a pencil, and then I don't have to worry about erasing anything off of my card later. With the halfway point marked, I can grab my first heart, and then I can bump up that heart to the edge of that tape, so that tape is doing those 2 jobs. I align that mark up with the dip in the pointy part of my heart, and then I can tape it in place, and I will go ahead and add my second small heart on there, and I'm just going to eyeball it at this point width-wise, but I can still bump it up against that tape so the height will be exactly the same. I will tape that in place, and then I can die cut both of these at once before moving on to the final heart. When I am ready to align that third heart, I'm going to leave the first central heart in place first, and that helps me get the same visual spacing as I did with the small heart on the opposite side. All right, now that this has been die cut and I'm done with the alignment, I can take that tape off. Sticky tape, the more you send it through the pressure of the die cut machine, the more likely it is to stick to your cardstock. So if you peel it back at an angle slowly, that helps get it off without any problems. For our next technique, we're going to kind of combine two techniques in one. We're going to do a partial embossing technique where we only use the end of the embossing folder. And again, the geometric embossing folder makes it really easy to line up and make sure you have straight. You just have to make sure you're not embossing over your hearts, although you could if you wanted to. I just like the look of it being right below my hearts. So with that lined up, I'm going to tape it in place on the back side of all of this because I want to use that inking technique. And if you've never done this before, it can be a little hard to get used to, but it is pretty fun. So my tips are: use an ink pad that's on the drier side. If you have spongy ink pads like mine, you want to use a very light touch and don't squish and press it down, and even do a little bit of a tap or a little bit of a slide. Oops, my stuff was starting to bump into things. So make sure you have enough room when you've got all of this laid out on your table so that that cardstock doesn't shift on you. Okay, with my ink in place, I'm gonna squeeze it down and hold it still so that the ink doesn't slide and smear while I put it into my sandwich. And I will put my top plate on my sandwich just slightly over the edge of where the end of that embossing folder is. But when you run it through the machine, you want to turn it around and run it fold first into your machine, and that helps prevent anything from jamming in there. All right, this first inking is a little bit light, so I'm going to do this whole process again. And there we go with the second inking. That is definitely better, and you can start seeing how those polka dots are a lighter shade than where the ink has been placed. So that creates a lovely tone-on-tone bit of detail to the front of this card, which will otherwise be fairly simple, but it will help you lead into the surprise on the inside of this card. All right, before we move on to that inside, we're going to stamp our Valentine's sentiment onto these hearts, and this is where Stamp Positioner is really helpful, at least for me. I want to get these words as even as possible, so I mount my stamp on my positioner, and then I kind of use the grid on my whole stamp positioner to see if I've got my heart in the right place. Now there's one more placement technique I learned from Jennifer McGuire, and that is to use more scrap plastic. Place it over the entirety of your image. Make sure it's taped down, or here I'm using magnets so that it doesn't slip and slide, because that won't give you the right placement if it is moved. And then I'm going to go ahead and stamp it the first time onto that plastic, and that will let me see if it's lined up. And I don't like the placement of this, so I'm going to move it up a little bit and to the left a little bit, and then I will try again. The second try looks a lot better, so I'm going to clean off that plastic, and I just have to wipe that ink away so that I can use it again for my other hearts, and I will go ahead and stamp my heart. In order to stamp just that one word, I will put a piece of tape or a scratch piece of paper over the rest of the words, ink up my stamp, and then go ahead and press it gently down on my heart, and I've got my sentiment centered on that heart. I'm going to repeat this process for all the other hearts. I do want to think about the order that I'm putting colors in. I chose 3 colors that are very contrasting with each other, because when you're stamping small sentiments, the color doesn't read as strongly as, say, ink blending would. So I am thinking about these colors very carefully, and I know the yellow is a much softer color than the other one, so I will stamp that yellow multiple times in order to get it to be way more saturated and kind of have the same weight as the rest of the colors. All right, now we can move to the inside of the card. I've cut a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 wide panel, but you can't just put that right into your card because the fold takes up some space. So I'm going to trim off like 1/8 of an inch. So if you find your 1/4 inch mark on your trimmer, just kind of push it back about halfway, or if you have an 1/8 inch mark, just line it up with that. And by trimming off that small sliver of cardstock, that will help everything fit inside better. Before we put it inside, we are going to do the surprise factor of this card, and that is a galaxy style ink blend. We're not going to do the dark background of the galaxy, we're just going to do the colorful part of the galaxy, if you've ever seen galaxy blends done before. All right, I'm going to make sure all of my blending brushes are clean-ish so that I'm getting the true colors that I chose from my ink palette here. And again, I've got my silicone mat out to help hold my ink in place. It will also give me a space to rub off any hot spots from my palette. And because we're putting this blending brush straight to the paper, I have a piece of scratch paper off on the right so that I can tap the brush over there to see how hot the color is coming in. Look at this. You can see that if I tap with this darker color, it's leaving a splotch. So I want to either rub that ink in more or come in with a super soft hand to help that ink start to blend before I put more pressure on my brush. Hopefully that makes sense to any new ink blenders or inexperienced ink blenders. Okay, when I've finished my first go round, I've done 3 splotches of each color to kind of get some color in there. And then I will come in and fill in any gaps with extra color and overlap those colors just a little bit, being careful that if you overlap a purple and a green, you're going to end up with kind of a browned color. So you want to be careful when those colors are butted up next to each other. And there we go. I've got my panel moved to the inside of my card, and it's got room to fold because we've cut off that sliver. Now you could leave the card just like that because I like seeing the galaxy of color through those holes. But we're going to make it a little bit more of a surprise than that, because when the recipient sees the card, they're not going to know all those colors are inside just yet. I will glue those sentiment hearts through the hole in the front down to our surprise pattern in the back. I'm going to spread the glue towards the edge for 2 reasons. I don't want it to ooze out the edge, and 2, I don't want that glue to stick to the front when I'm doing this process. Once it's all dry, you can see how pretty that is inside. But we're going to add a little more surprise. So I did cut out extra hearts when I did the stamping just in case I got them wrong, and I can use those as masks over my heart. And we are going to do a water splatter heat embossing technique. Now, I don't know anybody else who does this, but I discovered this one day and it's kind of fun. So I'm going to make sure my heat gun is hot because this process needs to go a little bit fast so your water doesn't dry on you as we go. I've got tweezers to remove my masks from my heart once I'm ready to go. I should have opened up my embossing powder first and gotten that ready to go, but I didn't. I'll have show you the problems and the fixes with that in just a moment. I do get my powder down onto that wet, and that wet will hold on to the powder for a little while as long as it's wet. So I can get my scratch paper going. I should have had that underneath me to begin with. Then very gently tap off the excess powder because it's not super sticky. You don't want to tap off everything. Now we need to heat set this from the back of the cardstock. And because I have 2 layers of cardstock here, this is a little tricky. Ideally, I should have done this before I glued that inner panel to the inside, but it is what it is at this point. Okay, you can see some of my powder fell off, and what I'm doing is I'm just using a paintbrush to touch spots of water over where I could see the water was before, and then add more embossing powder, heat that up, and here we go. This technique leaves a very, what I would say, relaxed looking, distressed look to this card, but because of the shine, it's super pretty. Now, I'm going to add some extra ink splatter to this just to kind of make bleach spots on my ink. My ink is water reactive, so it will leave those bleach spots behind. Hopefully you know what I mean by that, but we'll take a look at it in a minute. Because there was a lot of heat to get that embossing powder to melt, I do have to kind of bend my cardstock a little bit and make sure everything is smoothed out and ready to go for the final card. And we're going to add some sequins to this to give a little bit more of a decoration to the outside so it's not quite so stark before you see that inner surprise. But before we take that final look, let's go ahead and recap our other cards. Here was card number 1, which leaned traditional with a little bit of a twist. We've got some pinks and a shaker window as the traditional, and we've got some angled stripes in modern colors as our twist. Here is card number 2 that really takes that use of negative space to its fullest in this design. And here is our third card. So it looks pretty simple from the outside, but then you open it up and you get that burst of color and shine. Plus, here is that bonus card I hinted at a couple of times. I used all of the leftover hearts from the other cards to create this one. So that's it. What did you think? Did you find an inspiring technique or design that you want to recreate your own cards with? It could be Valentine's Day or some other occasion. I hope that you take these ideas and create something special with them. And if you do, I'd love you to join my Facebook group and share your creations over there. I will leave all the links down below if you want to find out more about that. I'll be back next week with some scrapbooking videos, so until I see you then, I hope you have an artful day.